Welcome to another episode of Adpack Insights. I'm Dino Kai, Strategic Advisor of Adpack. Today's episode is going to examine race versus ethnicity. What is the difference between the two? And how does one hold us back and the other one project us forward? Let's examine. So let's start with the definitions of race. What is race? Race is a social construct created by Europeans so that they could establish a racial hierarchy and structural inequality off the back of that. What is structural inequality? Otherwise commonly known as white supremacy. What is ethnicity? Ethnicity is our ancestry based on genetics, language, and historic culture, where there's no competition. We merely celebrate who we are and celebrate each other's differences. How does this affect us in the UK? So, to understand exactly how we are seen in the United Kingdom is as guests to a host nation. And we spoke about the structural inequality. So when we look at the police racial codes, they actually represent the national racial codes, where white IC1 represents Europeans, and there's an othering of all the ethnicities that fit into BAME, which is IC2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and unknown in 7, whatever they are and whoever they are. So what is racism? White supremacy is moderate, is liberal, and is conservative. So the answers for us are to ally based on our interests. Our interests remain a constant. Our enemy's enemy is our ally, and our interests remain a constant, and our allies must evolve. We are one of the few ethnicities that don't play this game. We play a very loyal game. So we just saw the elections in the United States, and as much as African Americans were ignored in terms of direct policy that will benefit them exclusively, they went out in droves and voted for Democrats without asking for any particular specific benefits. No tangibles. No tangibles were promised, and no tangibles are being considered in the first 100 days of office by Joe Biden. What the African American population were thrown were optics. So Kamala Harris equally has said that she's not going to deliver anything specific for African Americans. This is a policy called benign neglect. Benign neglect is a policy that is employed where all ethnicities other than Europeans are conflated into each other's problems, so that whenever you bring your specific needs, somebody else's needs are brought up. Now, once you were organized as a community, such as the Jewish community and the Latino community in the United States, where they demonstrated in the Obama administration their ability to effectively lobby and organize so that they could affect policy, resources towards their community, and the way that they were represented in Capitol Hill. Now, when we bring specific claims, the purpose of having us on the front bench in a sitting administration is to conflate issues. This was perfectly demonstrated by Priti Patel when she was put on the spot. So let's look at that clip and see just how effectively she does it. There's a talent to employing benign neglect, and every time we see it, we have to address it, and not only address it, but effectively coordinate our press so that we can target the actual specific politicians who are conveying that benign neglect.
Does the Home Secretary actually understand the anger and frustration felt by so many people? Does the Home Secretary recognise that this protest has been led by young people? Does the Home Secretary recognise that there's structural inequality, discrimination and racism in our country? Does the Home Secretary recognise that people want to see action from this government? My son turned 3 yesterday. I do not want to have to wait until he's a teenager before we see changes in this country. Will the Home Secretary and this government act now? Black Lives Matter, and we need to see this government doing something about that.
Yeah. I'd say to the Honourable Lady, I'd make a number of points, actually. I've been very clear in my remarks about the level of injustice that is felt across the country, and that's been illustrated in what we've seen over the weekend and the very peaceful protests that have taken place. But I'm really saddened that the Honourable Lady has effectively said that this government doesn't understand racial inequality. Well, on that basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, it must have been a very different Home Secretary who, as a child, was frequently called a packy in the playground. A very different Home Secretary who was racially abused in the streets, or even advised to drop her surname and use her husband's in order to advance her career. A different Home Secretary recently characterised, if Madam Deputy Speaker I can say so, in the Guardian newspaper as a fat cow with a ring through its nose, something that was not only racist but offensive, both culturally and religiously. This is hardly an example of respect, equality, tolerance or fairness. So when it comes to racism, sexism, tolerance or social justice, I will not take lectures from the other side of the House. I have already said repeatedly there is no place for racism in our country or in society. And sadly, too many people are too willing, too casually, to dismiss the contributions of those who don't necessarily conform to preconceived views or ideas about how ethnic minorities should behave or think. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my view, is racist in itself.
Excellent. So, benign neglect is actually a brilliant tactic to use to suppress any effective, coordinated defense of racism. It's like saying umbrellas make it rain. Priti Patel is backed up by all of her colleagues and knows exactly what her place and position are. Because when somebody who's an ethnic minority says it's not racism, it can't be racism. Now, another one of their tactics is to call us racist for calling out racism, which is ludicrous. Let's just examine for 30 seconds what racism is. Racism is a very effective system that involves education. So to start, racism in its practice is a team sport. Racism goes across education, banking, politics, and every area of life. Housing. Now, this is built into the architecture that maintains structural inequality that we give the colloquialism white supremacy. It is given legitimacy by the media, which is why you'll see publications like the Daily Mail and the Sun endorse police where there may have been an assassination of an African Caribbean man or woman, and there's always a justification. Why is this? Because it maintains the status quo and it keeps Europeans on a pedestal as IC1 and whites, and everybody else in the Malay on a rung lower. Now, we are IC3, but as you saw Priti Patel, she knows that she has a higher order in that pecking and utilizes it to perfection. So she isn't the only one that will use that policy of benign neglect publicly and unashamedly. You look at the health minister, Matt Hancock, when he was questioned on Sky after the George Floyd assassination, and he very clearly understood the question of how many black ministers are there in the cabinet. But what he did was he used the politically black Asian because he knows that black doesn't actually mean anything. It's not a legal definition for us as a people. So here he is, unable to hide it because the journalist was so vociferous in her answer and having a clear answer for African Caribbean black cabinet ministers, and he had nothing for.
Black people are in cabinet.
I'm so sorry, I didn't catch that question, Sophie.
How many black people are in the current cabinet?
There's a whole series of people from a black and minority ethnic background. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, to name but two. So
I'm just talking about blacks.
actually...
Sorry, I'm talking about black people specifically, because I do think it's quite important not to lump everyone from non-white backgrounds together, because obviously Asian people, for example, face prejudice too, but it might be a different prejudice to that faced by black people. 62%, for example, of GCSE pupils from Indian backgrounds got a strong pass in English and maths. 27% to black Caribbean. You're 3 times as likely to be stopped and searched if you're black than if you're Asian. So that's why I was specifically asking about how many black people there are in the current cabinet.
The two cabinets I've sat in with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister are the two most diverse cabinets I've ever sat in. Right at the top of government, including in the great offices of state, people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Kwasi Kwarteng was sitting around the cabinet table with me. I think that Boris Johnson has got a very good record on this, and it brings people in and listens to a diversity of views, and it's diversity of thought that's the really important thing when you're taking those big decisions around the cabinet table.
So, actually, are you saying then that people from black backgrounds shouldn't really worry that there isn't a single person from a black background at the current cabinet table because you have diversity of thought?
No, what I'm saying is that the cabinets, the governments that Boris Johnson leads are some of the most diverse in the history of this country.
Pure hyperbole, and it means absolutely nothing. So the game is rigged, and once we understand and quantify the difference between race and ethnicity, we realize that there is no point in taking part in the game that is based on racial codes, because we can never win. When he says that there are blacks in the cabinet and he's naming 2 Asians, and the rebuttal comes back, are you saying that blacks shouldn't be concerned that they're not represented? Let's look at just how many of us there are in the UK. And this is from the 2011 census. So by the measure of the 2011 census, we are 4.5% of the population at nearly 2.5 million. Now, take into account that a number of us didn't actually take part in that census. We don't have a trust of what government do with the information and just weren't particularly interested in taking part. This is also the time when the riots were taking place, or uprisings, based on the murder in Tottenham, a state-sponsored assassination with a hard stop policy that has been used more vociferously on our community than anybody else. And once we understand the nature of the gangs matrix, which again is a specific racial targeting, where we made up over 85% of a list, and take into account that we're only 4.5% of the country, we can clearly see where racial codes affect us. So let's come back to this chart. Understanding that Europeans separate themselves from the Malay of BAME, it puts them on a pedestal where they are the norm. And to go back and understand the team sport of racism and the practice of racism, let's start with education and school. So the education system omits colonial terrorism and celebrates the colonial empire. We are indoctrinated as ethnic minorities from our earliest instances, but there are 2 messages being heard there. because Europeans are hearing the normalizing of who they are, whilst the rest of us are made to understand that we are ethnic minorities, slightly less than. Not only that, but with the omission of colonial terrorism and Europe's role within that, we don't actually get to understand our history and our context of how we've come to be here. So we're always viewed as guests. Now, we're viewed as guests because the winners of that terrorism are the ones who tell the tale. Jews traditionally are allowed to tell their story and unhampered, where there is no conflation around the events of the Second World War, because the Germans lost that war. We are prisoners of war, and we lost the African Holocaust, and there were no allies to save us. Now, what they will bring up is the emancipation from slavery and the abolitionists. Well, what they don't tell us publicly is that 20 million was given in reparations to the so-called owners, those guilty of our kidnap and extortion of our free labor, commonly known as slavery, were financially recompensed, whereas we weren't. When we were set free, we didn't have homes, we didn't have a structure, we didn't have governance of any of the nations that we were in. And they continued to exploit our homelands on the continent and extrapolate the natural resources. So when we move swiftly on from education and what has been omitted, where the media play a very strong role is in endorsing and legitimizing everything that Europeans do when they aggress us. So one of the best and most effective tools they have against the continent is to create a trade embargo. So if you take Zimbabwe, for instance, they weren't able to sell any of their natural resources to anybody else. This does two things. It isolates them economically so that their population is going to blame the leader. And it also enables the employers of the trade embargo to know that the resources aren't going to be depleted. If you can't legally sell to anybody else based on legislation that was created by white supremacist architecture, then the resources are going to be exactly the same. This is what they did with Saddam in Iraq, so they knew that the oil resources weren't going to be depleted. In Zimbabwe, they know that the gold and the diamonds aren't going to be depleted, so that as soon as they make a deal with a patsy, they'll go right in and start to extract exactly what they did before there was a regime that resisted the colonial powers and their continuation of exploitation. So coming back to our numbers, here is where we start to look at the solutions. The initiatives such as Black Pound Day really showed us that there is an appetite for us to consume every single thing that we produce. And in the effective adoption by the majority of us nationally, you've now seen that Europeans in councillors, Birmingham especially, as one of the first European councillors to endorse and celebrate Black Pound Day, which is no offense to anybody else, and celebrates our diverse economy and the contribution that we make to the UK GDP. So what we've seen evidenced by this initiative is that once we endorse something and we adopt it, others will celebrate and adopt it. Google was a brilliant campaign. And what Swiss and his team have done is create a beautiful landscape for the applications that we've got next year. So we've got a banking license application going through with the Platinum Peak Bank, and we've got a National Chambers of Commerce application going through with the Black Chambers application. So what we want to do is support those campaigns and really demonstrate that with our numbers, because this is an economic reconstruction. An economic reconstruction for us, by us, where we're creating our own institutions to represent our own interests. What we need are our numbers to demonstrate the business case. So we are looking for 10,000 of us really to highlight and sign up with Adpack, so that when we are going for these applications, we can show that there is an effective business case and an exclusive audience ready to receive the benefits. So please go to our 10K sign up page and just fill in your details. We're not going to share your data with anybody. It's merely the numbers that support the case. So this economic reconstruction can't be underestimated. It's something that we have to do, and is also being championed by our counterparts on the continent and within the diaspora. So we are part of a 1.5 billion marketplace and family. We're working with the state of the African diaspora, who represent the 6th region of the African Union. This is a very powerful union, because what it allows us to do is create trade between us, and with nations like Ghana taking the place of Europe with Britain, there's no import or export duty between Britain and Ghana. So Adpack is organizing a trade mission to Ghana next year. With our initiatives that are on the ground already and those that we're structuring, it's a very bright 2021. So with Black Pound Day, the Black Chamber of Commerce, Platinum Peak Bank, and our political parties that have been established this year, the We Matter Party in Birmingham, that will soon become a national party, and taking the Initiative Party in London. So the policy of benign neglect is one that we're no longer willing to accept. And based on the fact that we've got 2 political parties, we have the ability to take part in local elections. Understanding our numbers, and this is why it's very important for us to collect our own data and understand that we are 3 million in the United Kingdom by the Office of National Statistics estimation. And knowing that those numbers who didn't take part in the census of 2011. So what is Adpack doing about that? We've partnered with Black Chat as a social network, who are taking part in our national census for eligible voters across the country. So by borough and by county, we'll understand just how many of us are in each ward. Once we have that clarity, that data and that intel, it gives us huge leverage when elections come up. It tells us that we can actually win local seats, have access to local resources, and start to change the landscape as far as our education is involved, because we'll be able to resource our own schools, which have been willfully neglected within that benign neglect policy. And once we start to take part and compete in the real economy of this country, we'll realize a very effective change. And to quote Powernomics, in any competitive environment, an individual or group that isn't competitive is sure to become extinct. Now, if we don't realize and acknowledge this, we're going to find ourselves not only where we've always been, but far behind, because the restart that we're seeing with COVID-19 policy is about creating a cashless society. Now, we have a large population who are unbanked in the United Kingdom. This will be addressed by the Platinum Peak Bank. But currently, as it stands, if we aren't able to establish our own institutions, many of us are going to be below the poverty line in 2021, taking into account that Europe and some of the basic human rights that were established within Europe won't be here. We don't know what the future holds. And the only defense that we have facing an uncertain future are our own resources, our own ability to incorporate our own institutions and represent our own interests. Now, the game of white supremacy is to trick us out of our position of clarity and tell us that it's selfish for us to exclusively organize for anything. But nothing that represents 3 million people in the United Kingdom can be viewed as selfish. It sounds ridiculous even to suggest it. Now, police brutality is another element of that white supremacist system. And there is a policy not to prosecute police, irrespective of the outcomes, which for us can involve death. Now, none of those police officers that have been involved in our deaths have been prosecuted. Here is a clear case of police brutality. And to this date, none of these officers have been prosecuted. This is a disabled man who was attacked by multiple officers and filmed. So, Adpack aren't fighting racism. It's a losing game. To fight racism is to fight a system that will shift and evolve based on political waves where they are defended by legislation and policy that will never represent our interests. What we're doing is establishing institutions and working with those who are establishing institutions and building databases so that we can make the support more robust for those institutions that are going to represent us. This is why we're working with political parties, initiatives, and institutions that are incorporating, because we matter as a people. It's great to say that Black Lives Matter, but it's always addressing and trying to convince somebody else. Let's take for granted that decency doesn't come into this. It's about politics, and politics is about economics. He who pays the piper calls the tune, and traditionally we haven't been organized enough to be able to pay anybody. We're not effectively lobbying. There is no umbrella organization that is effectively coordinating our interests in terms of media so that we can have a response globally, day and date, for anybody who transgresses our rights in a similar way to the Yiddish community whenever anything happens to them. It's not that we don't have the numbers. It's not that we don't have the professionals. We lack the coordinated will to defend our interests in terms of media outlets, in terms of advocacy, and definitely in terms of lobbying. So we realize that it's time to effectively coordinate all of the above. Racism is a team sport, and in order to compete with parity and exercise our sovereignty, we must establish an umbrella which is a team sport that goes across education, economics, employment, politics, housing, justice, and media. If we're not working in all of the areas in trade and industry, we're not establishing a solid economic base. And without an economic reconstruction, we'll be totally devastated as an ethnicity, definitely in Britain. And there's very little help coming from the continent. because similarly, they are looking towards us for solutions. So what are we asking from you? We are seeking for you to join us in Adpack as members. What does that offer? It offers monthly meetings, media that is specifically solution focused, and it would be great for you to contact us at our website and follow us on Instagram. We'll be launching at the end of December. Membership for individuals is £5, £15 for organizations, and £35 for non-African diaspora institutions. Now, we call them Friends of Adpack as allies. They could be civil service departments, banks, or any institutions that desire to have a relationship with us to conduct trade and build a relationship based on genuine parity and solidarity. So keep an eye on the website. Keep a lookout for the initiatives that we are promoting and enabling to become more robust. Look out for Adpack Insights, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming episodes. Subscribe to the channel, share the videos, and please share this information amongst your colleagues, friends, and family.